Picture this. You're standing at the altar in your dream wedding dress, surrounded by everyone you love, about to marry your soulmate. Then your own father bursts through the church doors, drunk and furious, screaming that you're making the biggest mistake of your life. In front of 150 guests, he declares you dead to the family before storming out, leaving you humiliated and heartbroken on what should have been the happiest day of your life. That nightmare became my reality 6 months ago. I'm Roberto Torres, and I never imagined that my wedding day would become the stage for the most devastating family betrayal I'd ever experienced. But what my father didn't know as he made that scene was that sitting quietly in the congregation was a man worth over $3 billion who had just become my father-in-law. The look on Dad's face when he found out who he'd just insulted is something I'll never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Millerville, Texas, population 8,000, my relationship with Dad was everything to me. Roberto Torres was the kind of father who made every other kid in town jealous. While other dads were too busy or too tired after long days at the oil refinery, mine was always present, always engaged, always making me feel like the center of his universe. Every Sunday after church, we had our ritual. Dad would take me to Rosita's Diner where I'd order chocolate chip pancakes and he'd get his black coffee and scrambled eggs. We'd sit in the same corner booth and he'd listen to me chatter about school, friends, and whatever 7-year-old drama was consuming my world that week. Those conversations made me feel heard in a way that shaped how I viewed relationships for the rest of my life. He taught me to change a tire in the driveway when I turned 16. Not because Mom couldn't do it, but because he wanted me to never feel helpless or dependent on anyone. Dad showed me how to check my oil, balance a checkbook, and throw a punch, if I ever needed to defend myself. His philosophy was simple. His daughter would be prepared for anything life threw at her. The walls of our small ranch house were covered with my achievements. Every report card, every certificate from school spelling bees, every ribbon from the county fair pie contest where I entered Mom's recipe. Dad would beam with pride as he carefully placed each new accomplishment on the refrigerator, announcing to anyone who visited that his Rebecca was destined for greatness. When I was 12 and decided I wanted to learn guitar, Dad worked overtime for 3 months to buy me a beautiful acoustic Martin from the music store in Austin. He'd sit on the front porch every evening, listening to me practice, never complaining about the off-key notes or repetitive scales. Instead, he'd applaud after every song, no matter how rough it sounded. High school brought new challenges, but Dad remained my constant supporter. When I decided to run for student body president, he helped me make campaign posters in the garage, his large hands carefully cutting out letters while mine glued them onto poster board. When I lost by 12 votes, he took me out for ice cream and told me that leadership wasn't about titles, but about character. And I had more character in my little finger than most adults had in their whole bodies. The summer before my senior year, I worked at the local veterinary clinic, and Dad would pick me up every day at closing time. During those 15-minute drives home, he'd ask about my day, genuinely interested in hearing about the animals I'd helped care for. When I mentioned considering veterinary school, his eyes lit up with possibilities. He started researching programs, scholarship opportunities, and began setting aside extra money for application fees. College applications became a family project. Dad would sit at the kitchen table with me, reading through requirements and helping me brainstorm essay topics. He wasn't college-educated himself, having gone straight to work after high school to support his family, but he was determined that I would have every opportunity he'd missed. His pride in my acceptance to Texas A&M was so overwhelming that he called every relative, neighbor, and coworker to share the news. The day he drove me to College Station for freshman orientation, I saw him cry for the first time in my life. Standing outside my dormitory with my boxes and suitcases scattered around us, he hugged me tight and whispered, "You're going to change the world, mija. I just know it." The drive back home must have been lonely for him, but he never made me feel guilty about leaving. Instead, his weekly phone calls were filled with encouragement and excitement about my studies. During those college years, Dad became my anchor. When organic chemistry nearly broke my spirit sophomore year, he'd stay on the phone with me for hours, not understanding the material, but listening to me work through problems out loud. When I switched majors from pre-veterinary to business, worried about disappointing him, he simply said, "As long as you're following your heart, I'm proud of you." Summer breaks were treasured time together. We'd fall back into our old routines, him teaching me new skills around the house, me helping him with projects in the garage. He never made me feel like I'd outgrown our small town or that my expanding worldview was a threat to our relationship. If anything, he seemed to enjoy learning about new ideas and perspectives through my experiences. My graduation day was one of his finest moments. Dressed in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to his brother's wedding 15 years earlier, Dad sat in the front row of the ceremony, his phone out recording every moment. When they called my name and I walked across that stage, his whooping and cheering could be heard over everyone else's family combined. Later, at the celebratory dinner, he stood up and gave an impromptu speech about how proud he was to be my father, his voice cracking with emotion. Those early post-college years when I moved to Dallas for my first marketing job were difficult for both of us. The adjustment from seeing each other daily to occasional weekend visits was hard, but Dad handled it with grace. He'd call every Sunday evening, always timing it perfectly to catch me after I'd gotten home from grocery shopping. We'd talk for an hour about work, life in the big city, and his updates about everyone back home. He visited my apartment exactly 3 times in those first 2 years, each visit planned weeks in advance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dad would drive the 3 hours from Millerville, bringing homemade tamales from Mom and staying just long enough to take me to dinner and make sure I was safe and happy. He never overstayed his welcome or made me feel guilty about my busy schedule. His support felt unconditional, unlimited, and utterly dependable. When I got promoted to senior marketing associate at 24, Dad's reaction was pure joy. He didn't fully understand what my job entailed, but he knew it was important and that I was succeeding. He started introducing me to people as my daughter, the executive, which always made me laugh because I was nowhere near executive level yet. But in his eyes, I was already at the top of the corporate ladder. Our relationship during those years felt unbreakable. He was my biggest cheerleader, my most trusted advisor, and my safe harbor in any storm. I never questioned his love or support, never doubted that he wanted the absolute best for me. Dad had created a foundation of security and confidence that I carried into every aspect of my adult life. Looking back now, I realize those golden years made what happened later so much more devastating. When someone who has been your unwavering support system suddenly becomes your harshest critic, the whiplash is almost unbearable. The same hands that had applauded my every achievement would soon be the ones pushing me away from the altar on my wedding day. But in those early years, before everything changed, Roberto Torres was simply the best father a daughter could ask for. He set the standard for how I expected to be treated by the men in my life, which is probably why I fell so hard for someone who showed me that same kind of respect and adoration. Dad had taught me what love looked like, even if he later forgot those lessons himself. After college, I threw myself into making Dad proud in every possible way. My apartment in Dallas was modest, but I made sure it was always spotless for his visits. I'd stock the refrigerator with his favorite Shiner Bock beer and make sure to have ingredients for his beloved breakfast tacos ready whenever he came to town. Every promotion, every achievement, every small victory in my career was immediately shared with him through excited phone calls where I could hear the pride radiating through his voice. I scheduled my vacation days around family events, never missing Mom's birthday parties or Dad's annual backyard barbecue for his coworkers. When my cousin Maria got married in San Antonio, I drove down Friday night after work, attended the ceremony Saturday, and drove back Sunday evening to be ready for Monday morning meetings. The 4-hour drive each way was exhausting, but seeing Dad's face light up when I walked into the reception made every mile worth it. Money was tight those first few years in Dallas, but I always found ways to contribute to family celebrations. When Dad's 50th birthday approached, I worked extra freelance projects for 2 months to afford a weekend trip to South Padre Island for the whole family. Watching him relax on the beach, cold beer in hand, laughing at Mom's attempts to body surf, filled me with a satisfaction that no work achievement could match. During the holidays, I transformed into the daughter who could do everything. I'd arrive home Wednesday night before Thanksgiving and immediately dive into cooking preparations with Mom. While she handled the turkey and traditional sides, I'd take over dessert duty, making Dad's favorite pecan pie from his grandmother's recipe. Christmas mornings meant waking up early to help Mom with breakfast while Dad sat in his recliner, coffee in hand, watching us bustle around the kitchen with contentment written across his face. The phone calls became my lifeline to home. Every Sunday at 6 in the evening, without fail, I'd dial their number while meal prepping for the week. Dad would answer on the second ring, always eager to hear about my work, my social life, my future plans. These conversations could stretch for hours, covering everything from office politics to his latest project, rebuilding the engine in his old Chevy pickup. I lived for the moments when he'd say, "That's my girl, always figuring things out," in response to whatever challenge I was navigating. When Dad hurt his back-lifting equipment at the refinery, I used my entire 2-week vacation allowance to come home and help around the house. For 14 days, I became his chauffeur, taking him to physical therapy appointments, grocery shopping, and handling yard work he couldn't manage. He protested the entire time that I was wasting my vacation on him, but I could see the relief in his eyes every time I lifted something heavy or reached something high. Those 2 weeks reinforced my role as the dependable daughter who would always put family first. My dating life suffered because of this devotion. Guys I met in Dallas couldn't understand why I spent so many weekends driving back to Millerville instead of exploring the city's social scene. When they'd invite me to parties or weekend trips, I'd often decline because I'd already committed to family obligations. Several promising relationships fizzled out because potential boyfriends felt like they were competing with my family for my attention, and honestly, family usually won. Dad noticed my single status and would occasionally ask about my romantic life during our Sunday calls. "Any interesting men in that big city, mija?" He'd inquire with the tone of someone who was curious but not particularly concerned. When I'd mention casual dates that hadn't developed into anything serious, he'd nod approvingly and say something like, "Good, you're too smart to settle for just anyone. The right man will appreciate everything you have to offer." His validation became addictive. Every decision I made was filtered through the question of whether it would make Dad proud. When I was offered a transfer to the company's Austin office with a significant salary increase, my first thought wasn't about career advancement or personal growth, but about how much closer I'd be to home and how happy that would make Dad. I ultimately turned down the position because it would have required extensive travel, and I didn't want to miss family gatherings. Work colleagues noticed my dedication to maintaining family relationships. During office happy hours, I'd politely decline invitations that conflicted with my established call schedule with home. When coworkers planned weekend trips or social events, I'd carefully consider whether participating would interfere with my visits to Millerville. This pattern earned me a reputation as reliable but perhaps overly attached to family, which I wore as a badge of honor rather than a limitation. The financial sacrifices I made for family were substantial but never felt burdensome. When Mom needed dental work that insurance didn't cover, I quietly transferred money from my savings account without mentioning it to Dad, knowing his pride would make him refuse help. When their air conditioning unit died during a brutal Texas summer, I purchased a replacement and had it installed as an early Father's Day present, deflecting his protests by insisting it was a practical gift that would benefit me during my visits home. My apartment became a shrine to family connections. Photos of Dad and me covered every surface, documenting fishing trips, graduation celebrations, and casual moments around the house. Co-workers who visited would comment on the obvious closeness of my family relationships, often expressing envy at the visible bond I shared with my parents. I'd beam with pride while explaining how supportive and loving my father was, how he'd always encouraged my dreams and celebrated my successes. Shopping for Dad became one of my favorite activities. I'd spend hours in stores looking for the perfect birthday or Christmas gifts, always searching for items that showed how well I knew his interests and preferences. Tools for his garage workshop, books about classic cars, comfortable work shirts, in his exact size, specialty barbecue rubs for his weekend grilling sessions. Each gift was carefully chosen to demonstrate my attention to his needs and desires, and his genuine appreciation for these thoughtful presents reinforced my belief that I was the ideal daughter. Social media became another avenue for showcasing our relationship. My Instagram and Facebook feeds were filled with photos of Dad and me at family events, accompanied by captions about how blessed I was to have such an amazing father. Friends would comment on these posts with heart emojis and expressions of admiration for our close bond. These public displays of affection felt natural and authentic, reflecting the genuine love and respect I felt for the man who had shaped my understanding of what family loyalty meant. The pattern extended to my professional life as well. During networking events and business conferences, I'd often mention my father when discussing my background and values. My dad always taught me that integrity is everything, I'd say when explaining my approach to client relationships. He showed me that hard work and dedication are the foundations of success. These references weren't calculated for effect. They reflected how deeply his influence had shaped my professional identity. Looking back, I can see how this dynamic set me up for the devastating betrayal that would come later. By making Dad's approval the centerpiece of my identity, I created a vulnerability that would be ruthlessly exploited when his support turned to condemnation. But during those years of building my career and establishing my adult life, his unwavering pride felt like the greatest gift a daughter could receive. Everything in my carefully ordered world shifted the night I met Jonathan Kim at a marketing conference in Houston. I'd attended dozens of these industry events over the years, usually focused on collecting business cards and attending workshops rather than socializing. But there was something different about that evening's networking reception. Maybe it was the elegant hotel ballroom or the unusually relaxed atmosphere, but I found myself actually enjoying conversations instead of just enduring them. Jonathan approached me during a discussion about digital marketing trends, offering insights that immediately caught my attention. He wasn't trying to impress anyone or dominate the conversation like so many men at these events. Instead, he listened carefully to others' opinions and responded with thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity about different perspectives. His quiet confidence was magnetic in a room full of people trying too hard to prove their expertise. We talked for over an hour that first night, and I was struck by how easy the conversation felt. He was pursuing his MBA at Rice University, while working full-time at a sustainable energy startup, juggling responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most people, but which he handled with remarkable composure. When he mentioned his passion for environmental technology and renewable energy solutions, his eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that was both intelligent and endearing. What impressed me most was his approach to ambition. Unlike other driven professionals I'd met who seemed consumed by status and recognition, Jonathan talked about his work in terms of impact and legacy. He wanted to build companies that solved real problems, not just generate profit. His family had immigrated from South Korea when he was 8 years old, and he spoke about their sacrifice and hard work with a reverence that reminded me of my own appreciation for Dad's dedication to our family. After the conference ended, We stayed in touch through text messages and phone calls. Our conversations ranged from work challenges to childhood memories, from favorite movies to career aspirations. Jonathan had a way of asking questions that made me think more deeply about my own goals and motivations. When I mentioned my close relationship with my family, he responded with genuine interest rather than the mild discomfort I'd encountered with other men who seemed threatened by strong family bonds. Our first official date was 3 weeks later when he drove to Dallas from Houston, a gesture that immediately impressed me. He'd researched restaurants in my neighborhood and chosen a small Italian place that felt intimate without being pretentious. Over dinner, we discovered shared values about family loyalty, professional integrity, and the importance of building meaningful relationships rather than just accumulating superficial connections. Jonathan's background fascinated me. His parents had arrived in America with limited English and even less money, working multiple jobs to support their family while adapting to a completely different culture. His father had been an engineer in Korea, but spent his first years in America working in restaurants and construction while studying to pass American certification exams. His mother cleaned office buildings at night while attending English classes during the day, determined to create better opportunities for her children. These stories resonated deeply with my own family's experience. While Dad hadn't immigrated from another country, he'd worked multiple jobs and made significant sacrifices to provide opportunities for me that he'd never had himself. Jonathan and I bonded over our shared understanding of parental sacrifice and the responsibility we felt to honor those sacrifices through our own achievements and character. The early months of our relationship unfolded gradually and naturally. Jonathan would drive to Dallas every other weekend, and I'd make the trip to Houston on alternating weekends. We'd explore different neighborhoods, try new restaurants, attend cultural events, and spend hours talking about everything and nothing. His presence in my life felt like a missing piece clicking into place, adding richness and depth to experiences I'd previously enjoyed alone. What made Jonathan different from previous boyfriends was his genuine interest in my family and background. When I'd share stories about Dad's wisdom or Mom's cooking, he'd listen with attention and ask follow-up questions that showed he understood how important these relationships were to me. He never seemed jealous of my family commitments or impatient with my Sunday phone call rituals. Instead, he'd often suggest we plan weekend visits around my family obligations, demonstrating a flexibility that felt respectful rather than accommodating. When I finally decided to introduce Jonathan to my parents after 6 months of dating, I was nervous but excited. The drive to Millerville felt longer than usual as I mentally prepared for the meeting that would determine whether my two worlds could successfully merge. Jonathan seemed calm and confident, asking thoughtful questions about Dad's work and interests, Mom's hobbies and personality, and the dynamics of our small-town community. The first meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon in October. Mom had prepared her famous enchiladas, and Dad had taken the day off work to be present for this important introduction. As we pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, I felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. This was the man I was falling in love with, meeting the man who had been the center of my world for 26 years. Dad's initial reaction was polite, but reserved. He shook Jonathan's hand firmly, made appropriate small talk about the drive from Dallas, and offered him a beer from the refrigerator. But I could sense an underlying tension that I'd never experienced before. Dad's usual warmth and immediate acceptance of new people seemed muted, replaced by a careful evaluation that felt uncharacteristic and concerning. During dinner, Jonathan impressed everyone with his genuine interest in Dad's work at the refinery and his thoughtful questions about life in Millerville. He complimented Mom's cooking with sincere appreciation, asked about local history and community traditions, and showed none of the urban condescension that might have been expected from someone with his educational background and career trajectory. Yet Dad remained distant, cordial, but not welcoming. After Jonathan and I returned to Dallas that evening, I called home the next day to check on everyone's impressions. Mom was effusive in her praise, talking about how polite and respectful Jonathan had been, how intelligent his questions were, and how happy I seemed in his presence. But when I asked to speak with Dad, his response was notably different. "He seems like a nice enough young man," Dad said carefully, his tone neutral in a way that felt loaded with unspoken reservations. When I pressed for more specific feedback, he simply repeated that Jonathan appeared to be decent and educated, but there was something in his voice that suggested these weren't necessarily positive qualities in his assessment. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in my interactions with Dad. Our Sunday phone calls became shorter and more focused on practical matters, rather than the deep, rambling conversations we'd always enjoyed. When I'd mention Jonathan, in passing, Dad would acknowledge the information without follow-up questions or expressions of interest. The enthusiastic support and curiosity he'd always shown about my life seemed to diminish whenever my relationship entered the conversation. The shift was gradual enough that I initially attributed it to normal parental adjustment to their daughter's serious relationship. But as months passed and Dad's warmth toward Jonathan never materialized, I began to worry that something deeper was happening. The man who had always celebrated my happiness seemed uncomfortable with the source of my current joy, creating a tension that would only intensify as our relationship deepened. As my relationship with Jonathan deepened over the following year, I found myself working harder than ever to maintain the delicate balance between my love life and family loyalty. The Sunday phone calls became strategic exercises in sharing just enough about my relationship to keep Dad informed while avoiding topics that might trigger his subtle but persistent disapproval. When Jonathan and I decided to take a weekend trip to Austin for a music festival, I framed it to Dad as a professional networking opportunity rather than a romantic getaway. When we spent a long weekend exploring San Antonio's historic districts, I emphasized the educational and cultural aspects rather than the intimate dinners and late-night conversations that made the trip memorable. These small deceptions felt necessary to preserve Dad's comfort level, though they left me feeling increasingly torn between authenticity and family harmony. The holidays that year presented the first major test of managing dual loyalties. Jonathan had been invited to spend Thanksgiving with his extended family in Los Angeles, a gathering that happened only every few years when relatives could coordinate travel from across the country. He asked if I'd consider joining him, which would mean missing my first Thanksgiving at home since college. The internal conflict was excruciating. Part of me was honored to be included in such an important family celebration and excited about meeting the relatives Jonathan spoke of with such affection. But the thought of disappointing Dad by breaking our established traditions felt impossible to bear. I ultimately chose to stay in Texas, spending Thanksgiving with my parents while Jonathan flew to California alone. Dad's relief when I confirmed my plans was palpable, though he tried to hide it behind casual comments about how nice it would be to have the whole family together. Mom seemed to understand the sacrifice I was making, giving me extra attention throughout the weekend and expressing genuine interest in hearing about Jonathan's family gathering when he returned. Christmas presented an even more complex challenge. Jonathan's parents had planned a 2-week vacation to South Korea to visit extended family, their first trip back in 5 years. Jonathan was torn between accompanying them and staying in Texas to spend the holidays with me. When he ultimately decided to prioritize family time, I found myself both proud of his decision and secretly relieved that I wouldn't have to choose between him and my own family traditions. But the relief was complicated by Dad's reaction to Jonathan's absence. Instead of expressing understanding or sympathy for the scheduling conflict, Dad made several comments about how important it was to find a partner who shared your priorities and values. "Family comes first," he said during Christmas dinner, his tone carrying implications that felt pointed and uncomfortable. The new year brought new challenges as Jonathan and I began discussing more serious aspects of our future together. We'd been dating for over a year, and conversations about career goals, life plans, and relationship expectations became more frequent and detailed. Jonathan's ambitions were impressive but also demanding, requiring geographic flexibility and long-term commitment to building something significant in the sustainable energy sector. When he was offered an internship opportunity with a renewable energy company in Austin, the 2-hour drive seemed manageable compared to the current Houston-Dallas arrangement. We both saw this as a positive development that would allow us to spend more time together while he completed his MBA program remotely. I was excited about the possibility of more frequent weekend visits and the chance to explore Austin's vibrant cultural scene together. However, when I mentioned this development to Dad during one of our phone calls, his response was surprisingly negative. Instead of being happy about the convenience of having Jonathan closer to home, he seemed concerned about what this meant for my own career and life choices. "You're not planning to move to Austin too, are you?" he asked, his tone suggesting that such a decision would be both impractical and disappointing. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't seriously considered relocating, but Dad's immediate assumption that I might uproot my established life for a relationship felt like an accusation rather than a concerned inquiry. When I assured him that I was happy with my job in Dallas and had no immediate plans to move, he seemed only partially reassured. Spring brought another test when Jonathan suggested we take a long weekend trip to meet his parents, who were visiting Austin from Houston for a university event. This would be my first extended interaction with his family, and I was both nervous and excited about the opportunity to deepen my understanding of his background and upbringing. The weekend went beautifully. Jonathan's parents were warm, intelligent, and genuinely interested in getting to know me. His mother shared stories about their early years in America, the challenges of adapting to a new culture while maintaining their Korean heritage, and their pride in Jonathan's achievements and character. His father spoke about the importance of education, hard work, and building something meaningful with your life, values that aligned perfectly with everything Dad had taught me. I returned from Austin energized and happy, eager to share details about the wonderful weekend with my own parents. Mom was delighted to hear about my positive experience with Jonathan's family and asked thoughtful questions about their backgrounds, interests, and impressions of me. But Dad's reaction was notably cooler, focusing more on practical concerns than emotional connection. "They sound very accomplished," he said when I described Jonathan's parents' professional achievements and community involvement. But the comment felt more like an observation than praise, delivered with a tone that suggested their accomplishments might be intimidating rather than impressive. When I shared some of the stories Jonathan's mother had told about their immigration experience and early struggles in America, Dad listened politely, but didn't engage with the same interest he typically showed when I talked about new people I'd met. His response was limited to neutral acknowledgments that failed to demonstrate the empathy and curiosity I'd expected. The most telling moment came when I mentioned how much Jonathan's parents had emphasized the importance of family loyalty and maintaining cultural traditions while adapting to American life. Instead of recognizing the parallels to his own values and teachings, Dad seemed to interpret this as evidence of divided loyalties or competing allegiances. "It's good that they value family," he said carefully. "But sometimes people from different backgrounds have different ideas about what family obligations mean." The comment felt loaded with implications I didn't fully understand, but that left me feeling defensive and confused. Summer brought the relationship milestone I'd been both anticipating and dreading: Jonathan's suggestion that we consider moving in together. His lease was ending in Houston, and with his successful internship likely turning into a full-time offer in Austin, it seemed practical and romantic to take this next step together. The conversation about cohabitation with Dad was one of the most difficult I'd ever initiated. I approached it carefully, emphasizing the practical benefits like shared expenses and the serious nature of our commitment, rather than the romantic aspects that actually motivated the decision. But Dad's reaction was immediate and strongly negative. "Living together without marriage sends the wrong message about your values," he said, his disappointment evident in every word. "I raised you to respect yourself and demand respect from others. Moving in with a man who hasn't made a permanent commitment doesn't reflect the standards I tried to teach you." The judgment in his voice was sharper than anything I'd experienced since childhood, and it left me feeling simultaneously defensive and ashamed. I tried to explain that modern relationships often included periods of cohabitation as a natural progression toward marriage, but Dad remained unconvinced and visibly upset by my reasoning. This conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in our relationship, one characterized by Dad's increasing disapproval of choices that had previously been celebrated as signs of my independence and good judgment. The daughter who could do no wrong was suddenly making decisions that disappointed and concerned the father, whose approval had always been the foundation of my self-worth. The decision to move in with Jonathan marked a turning point that I couldn't have anticipated. What should have been an exciting milestone in our relationship became the source of ongoing tension with Dad that colored every family interaction and phone conversation. The easy, comfortable dynamic we'd maintained for over 2 decades suddenly felt strained and fragile. Our new apartment in Austin was beautiful, a second-floor unit in a converted historic building with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and large windows that filled the space with natural light. Jonathan and I spent weeks carefully choosing furniture and decorations that reflected both of our tastes, creating a home that felt uniquely ours. The process of blending our belongings and establishing shared routines brought us closer together, in ways I hadn't expected. But the joy of building this life together was overshadowed by Dad's obvious displeasure with the arrangement. When I'd call home with updates about apartment hunting, decorating decisions, or settling into Austin life, his responses were notably brief and lacking in enthusiasm. The man who had previously shown genuine interest in every detail of my living situation now seemed uncomfortable discussing my new domestic arrangements. The first time my parents visited the new apartment, the tension was immediately apparent. Mom made appropriate compliments about the space and asked interested questions about our neighborhood and local amenities. She admired the artwork we'd chosen, complimented our furniture selections, and seemed genuinely happy to see me settled and content in my new environment. Dad, however, walked through the apartment with the careful attention of someone conducting an inspection rather than enjoying a social visit. He examined the lease documents I'd proudly shown him, made practical comments about utility costs and parking arrangements, and maintained a polite but distant demeanor throughout the tour. When Jonathan offered to show him the rooftop deck and building amenities, Dad declined with a mumbled excuse about being tired from the drive. The most uncomfortable moment came when Dad noticed that Jonathan and I were obviously sharing the master bedroom, a reality that was impossible to disguise despite our efforts to keep personal items discreet and maintain appropriate boundaries during the visit. His face tightened with disapproval, though he said nothing directly about the living arrangement that clearly violated his traditional values. After my parents left that afternoon, I felt emotionally drained from managing the undercurrents of tension and disappointment that had permeated their visit. Jonathan, characteristically sensitive to family dynamics, recognized my distress and suggested we talk through whatever was bothering me about the interaction with Dad. Explaining Dad's traditional values and expectations felt like betraying both men in my life. I found myself defending Dad's conservative worldview to Jonathan while simultaneously feeling frustrated by his inability to accept my adult choices. The conversation revealed how much energy I was expending trying to maintain harmony between two relationships that seemed increasingly incompatible. Work provided some refuge from family tensions, but even there I found myself censoring details about my personal life when talking with colleagues. The marketing team often shared stories about their romantic relationships and living situations, but I became careful about mentioning specifics that might eventually make their way back to professional contacts in Dallas who knew my family. The isolation this created was subtle, but persistent. I'd developed a habit of compartmentalizing different aspects of my life to avoid conflicts that felt increasingly inevitable. My relationship with Jonathan flourished in the privacy of our shared space, But I struggled to integrate that happiness with the family relationships that had previously been the source of my greatest security and confidence. Jonathan's career continued to advance rapidly during this period. The renewable energy company offered him a full-time position with significant responsibility and impressive compensation, validating his decision to relocate to Austin and pursue opportunities in the sustainable technology sector. His success brought opportunities for travel, networking events, and industry recognition that reflected his expertise and dedication. I was genuinely proud of Jonathan's achievements and excited about his professional growth, but I found myself downplaying his success when talking with Dad. Conversations about Jonathan's promotions, travel opportunities, and industry involvement seemed to increase Dad's discomfort rather than generate the pride and interest I'd hoped for. During one particularly awkward phone call, Dad asked directly about Jonathan's income and financial prospects, questions that felt invasive and inappropriate given our family's typically private approach to money matters. When I deflected these inquiries, Dad's response suggested he was concerned about Jonathan's ability to provide financial security, though his tone implied that success in unfamiliar industries wasn't as reliable as traditional employment. The cultural differences between Jonathan's family and mine became more apparent as our relationship deepened and family interactions increased. Jonathan's parents approached gift-giving, celebration traditions, and social expectations differently than what I'd grown up with. Not better or worse, but distinctly different in ways that seemed to make Dad uncomfortable. When Jonathan's mother sent me a beautiful silk scarf from a recent trip to Seoul, along with a thoughtful note expressing her happiness about our relationship, I shared this gesture with Mom, who was delighted by the kindness and sophistication of the gift. But when I mentioned it to Dad, his reaction focused on the expense and formality of the gesture, rather than the sentiment behind it. "Seems like they're trying pretty hard to impress you," he said, his tone suggesting that generosity might be manipulative rather than genuine. The comment stung because it implied that my judgment about people's motivations couldn't be trusted, a doubt that felt particularly hurtful coming from someone whose opinion had always been my anchor. Food became another unexpected source of tension. Jonathan was an excellent cook with sophisticated tastes developed through travel and cultural curiosity. He introduced me to Korean dishes, fusion cuisine, and international flavors that expanded my palate and provided wonderful shared experiences in our kitchen. Cooking together became one of our favorite weekend activities, trying new recipes and techniques while talking about our weeks and planning future adventures. But when I'd mention these culinary experiments during family phone calls, Dad's responses suggested that foreign food was unnecessarily complicated compared to the straightforward American cuisine he preferred. His comments about exotic ingredients and fancy cooking techniques carried undertones of suspicion about anything that deviated from familiar traditions. The most painful realization was that Dad seemed to view my relationship with Jonathan as evidence that I was rejecting the values and lifestyle he'd worked so hard to provide. Instead of seeing my happiness and growth as positive outcomes of his parenting, he appeared to interpret my choices as criticism of everything he'd taught me about life, relationships, and priorities. This perception created a dynamic where every positive development in my relationship felt like a potential threat to my connection with Dad. Jonathan's successes, our shared happiness, and the natural progression of our commitment were filtered through Dad's growing concern that I was moving away from family, geographically and emotionally. The weight of managing these competing loyalties became exhausting. I found myself editing conversations, downplaying achievements, and carefully crafting narratives that might minimize Dad's discomfort while still maintaining honesty about my life and choices. But no amount of careful communication seemed sufficient to bridge the growing gap between Dad's expectations and my reality. By the end of our first year living together, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Dad that might be irreversible. The unconditional support and pride that had defined our connection was being replaced by conditional acceptance based on choices that aligned with his comfort level rather than my authentic happiness and growth. The proposal happened on a crisp November evening during a weekend trip to Fredericksburg. Jonathan had planned everything perfectly, choosing a quiet spot overlooking the Texas Hill Country where we'd stopped to watch the sunset after spending the day touring local wineries. When he dropped to one knee and opened the ring box, revealing a stunning vintage sapphire surrounded by diamonds, I was completely overwhelmed with joy and disbelief. My first instinct was to call Dad immediately and share the incredible news. As Jonathan slipped the ring onto my finger and we held each other in the fading daylight, I was already imagining Dad's reaction to hearing that his little girl was engaged to be married. I pictured his excitement, his immediate questions about wedding plans, his pride in seeing me reach this major life milestone with someone who clearly adored me. The drive back to Austin was filled with giddy conversation about calling our families, planning the engagement announcement, and beginning to think about wedding details. Jonathan was as excited as I was to share our news, eager to officially become part of my family and to welcome me fully into his. We decided to call our parents as soon as we got home, wanting to share the moment while the excitement was still fresh and overwhelming. When I dialed my parents' number that evening, my hands were literally shaking with anticipation. Mom answered on the second ring, and I immediately launched into the story of our romantic evening and Jonathan's beautiful proposal. Her reaction was everything I'd hoped for, filled with squeals of delight, demands to hear every detail, and immediate questions about the ring, the proposal, and our timeline for planning the wedding. Dad came to the phone after Mom had exhausted her initial round of excited questions, and I expected his response to match her enthusiasm. Instead, there was a long pause after I repeated the news, followed by a careful, measured response that immediately dampened my celebratory mood. "Well, that's quite a development," he said, his tone neutral in a way that felt almost clinical. "I suppose congratulations are in order." The words were technically appropriate, but they lacked any genuine warmth or excitement, delivered more like an acknowledgement of information than a celebration of joyful news. When I pressed him for a more enthusiastic response, asking if he wasn't happy for me, Dad's reply revealed the depth of his reservations about my relationship. "I'm happy if you're happy, Rebecca," he said slowly, "but marriage is a serious commitment that shouldn't be rushed. You've only been living together for a year. Maybe you should take more time to really get to know each other before making such a permanent decision." The suggestion that I didn't know Jonathan well enough to marry him felt like a slap in the face. We'd been together for nearly 2 years, had navigated the challenges of long-distance dating, had successfully merged our lives and living situations, and had countless deep conversations about our values, goals, and dreams for the future. If anything, I felt like I knew Jonathan better than I'd ever known anyone in my life. But Dad's concerns went deeper than timing issues. As the conversation continued, he expressed doubts about whether Jonathan and I were truly compatible in the ways that mattered for a lasting marriage. "He comes from a very different background," Dad said carefully. "Different culture, different expectations about family roles and responsibilities. Those differences might seem small now, but they have a way of becoming bigger problems over time." The barely concealed prejudice in his words was shocking and painful. Dad was essentially arguing that cultural differences made our relationship unsuitable for marriage, despite the fact that Jonathan and I shared fundamental values about integrity, family loyalty, hard work, and mutual respect. The man who had raised me to judge people by their character rather than their background was now suggesting that background was more important than compatibility. When I tried to defend our relationship by highlighting all the ways Jonathan and I were perfectly matched in terms of values, goals, and treatment of each other, Dad's response revealed even deeper concerns about my judgment and decision-making abilities. "You're still young, Rebecca," he said in a patronizing tone I'd never heard from him before. "Sometimes when we want something badly enough, we overlook red flags or convince ourselves that problems don't exist. The implication that I was too naive or desperate to accurately assess my own relationship was devastating. This was the same man who had always trusted my judgment, celebrated my independence, and expressed confidence in my ability to make good decisions about my life and future. Now he was treating me like a foolish child who couldn't be trusted to choose an appropriate life partner. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Dad claiming he needed time to process the news and promising to call back in a few days to discuss wedding plans. But instead of feeling supported and celebrated, I hung up the phone feeling confused, hurt, and angry. The most important announcement of my adult life had been met with skepticism and thinly veiled disapproval from the person whose opinion mattered most to me. Jonathan immediately noticed my changed mood and asked what had happened during the call with my parents. Explaining Dad's reaction without making Jonathan feel unwelcome or criticized was nearly impossible. I found myself making excuses for Dad's response, suggesting that he was just surprised by the timing and needed time to adjust to the idea of his daughter getting married. But privately, I was devastated by the realization that Dad's growing. Discomfort with my relationship had evolved into active opposition to our future together. The engagement, which should have been a bridge bringing our families together in celebration, had instead revealed the depth of the divide that had been growing for months. The following days were emotionally complicated as I tried to maintain excitement about wedding planning while processing Dad's rejection of what should have been purely joyful news. When friends and colleagues congratulated me on the engagement, their genuine enthusiasm highlighted how abnormal Dad's reaction had been. Normal parents celebrated their children's engagements. They didn't immediately question the wisdom of the decision or suggest waiting longer to be sure. Jonathan's parents' response provided a stark contrast to my family's reception of our engagement news. When we called them the same evening, they were immediately thrilled, expressing genuine happiness about our decision to marry and eagerly discussing plans for meeting my family and participating in wedding preparations. Their warm acceptance of me as their future daughter-in-law made Dad's coolness even more painful by comparison. The engagement ring became a symbol of this family divide. When I wore it around Jonathan's family and friends, it generated excitement, compliments, and happy conversations about our upcoming wedding. But when I visited home to show my parents the ring in person, Dad barely glanced at it, offering only a brief comment about hoping it hadn't been too expensive before changing the subject to other matters. Mom tried to bridge the gap by expressing appropriate enthusiasm and asking to hear the proposal story again, but even her excitement seemed muted by Dad's obvious displeasure with the situation. The family dynamic that had always been characterized by shared joy and mutual support was now strained by conflicting reactions to the most significant development in my adult life. Wedding planning conversations became exercises in diplomatic navigation. When I'd call home to share ideas about venues, guest lists, or ceremony details, Mom would engage enthusiastically while Dad remained largely silent or offered practical concerns rather than excitement about the celebration. His questions focused on costs, logistics, and timeline rather than the emotional significance of the event. The most painful moment came when I asked Dad directly if he was planning to walk me down the aisle, a tradition I'd assumed was automatic given our close relationship and his central role in my life. His response was hesitant and conditional, suggesting that his participation in the wedding would depend on various factors that he wasn't ready to discuss in detail. The idea that Dad might not walk me down the aisle had never occurred to me as a possibility. In every vision I'd had of my future wedding, he was a central figure, proudly escorting me to marry the man I loved. The suggestion that his participation was uncertain rather than guaranteed shattered something fundamental in my understanding of our relationship and his commitment to supporting my happiness. This conversation marked the moment when I realized that Dad's disapproval of my relationship with Jonathan wasn't just a phase of adjustment that would resolve itself over time. His opposition was deep-seated and potentially permanent, threatening not just his relationship with Jonathan, but his relationship with me as well. The father who had always been my greatest champion was becoming an obstacle to my future happiness, creating a conflict that seemed to have no resolution. The weeks following our engagement should have been filled with joy, anticipation, and family bonding as we planned the most important celebration of our lives together. Instead, they were marked by tension, disappointment, and the growing realization that my marriage to Jonathan might require choosing between my future happiness and my family relationships. The wound Dad's reaction created went deeper than disappointment. It fundamentally altered my understanding of his love and acceptance, revealing conditions I'd never known existed. As wedding planning progressed over the following months, Dad's approach to undermining my engagement became increasingly sophisticated and psychologically manipulative. Rather than expressing direct opposition that I could confront and address, he began employing subtle tactics designed to make me question my own perceptions and decisions without being able to pinpoint exactly what was wrong. The technique started with seemingly innocent questions about Jonathan's background and intentions that were framed as fatherly concern, but carried underlying implications of suspicion and doubt. "Have you met his extended family yet?" Dad would ask during our phone calls. It's important to understand what kind of people you're marrying into. Sometimes people can seem one way when they're trying to make a good impression, but their true nature comes out once you're officially part of the family. These questions planted seeds of uncertainty about aspects of my relationship that I'd never thought to worry about. Jonathan's family had been nothing but welcoming and supportive, but Dad's suggestions that they might be hiding their true feelings or intentions made me start analyzing every interaction for hidden meanings or signs of rejection that simply didn't exist. When I'd defend Jonathan's family by describing their kindness and acceptance of me, Dad would nod thoughtfully and respond with comments like, "I'm sure they're very polite. People from that background are usually quite formal and proper in social situations. But politeness isn't the same as genuine acceptance, is it?" His tone suggested that my interpretation of their behavior was naive and that I was missing subtle signs of disapproval that a more experienced person would recognize. The wedding planning process became another avenue for Dad's psychological manipulation. When I'd share exciting developments about venue bookings, dress shopping, or vendor selections, he'd respond with concerns about practicality and appropriateness that were designed to deflate my enthusiasm without directly criticizing my choices. "That sounds like quite an elaborate celebration," he'd say after I'd describe our plans for the reception. "I hope Jonathan's family appreciates all the effort you're putting into making everything perfect for them." Sometimes when one family does most of the planning, the other family can feel like they're just guests at someone else's party rather than equal participants in their child's wedding. These comments were crafted to make me second-guess decisions I'd been excited about, suggesting that my efforts to create a beautiful wedding were somehow inappropriate or one-sided. Dad would never directly say that our plans were too expensive, too fancy, or too accommodating to Jonathan's family, but his implications left me feeling defensive about choices that should have been purely celebratory. The most insidious aspect of Dad's approach was how he'd frame his concerns as protection and wisdom rather than criticism and disapproval. "I just want you to be happy, mija," he'd say after planting doubts about some aspect of my relationship or wedding plans. "I've been around longer than you have, and I can see things from a different perspective. It's my job as your father to ask the hard questions that maybe you haven't thought of yet." This positioning made it nearly impossible to confront his behavior directly without seeming ungrateful for his care and concern. How do you argue with someone who claims to be looking out for your best interests? How do you challenge advice that's presented as loving guidance rather than judgment and interference? The gaslighting extended to my own emotions and reactions to his behavior. When I'd express frustration or hurt about his lack of enthusiasm for my engagement, Dad would suggest that I was being overly sensitive or reading too much into normal parental concerns. "I think you're so excited about getting married that you're interpreting any questions or advice as criticism," he'd say. "Maybe you should take a step back and try to see this situation more objectively." This response made me doubt my own perceptions, and emotional responses, wondering if I was indeed being too sensitive or defensive about legitimate parental concerns. Dad's ability to reframe his disapproval as normal behavior and my hurt as overreaction was psychologically destabilizing, making me question not just his motivations, but my own judgment about what was happening in our relationship. Financial aspects of the wedding became another tool for subtle manipulation. Dad would make comments about the cost of various elements without directly offering to help or expressing clear objections to the expenses. Wedding flowers can be surprisingly expensive, he'd observe after I'd mentioned meeting with a florist. I hope you and Jonathan have really thought through all the costs involved in this kind of celebration. Young couples sometimes get caught up in the romance and don't realize how much they're spending until it's too late. These observations were technically accurate, but delivered in a tone that suggested irresponsibility and poor planning rather than normal wedding expenses that most couples manage successfully. Dad never offered specific financial assistance or concrete alternatives, but his implications that we were being financially reckless added stress and self-doubt to what should have been enjoyable planning conversations. The psychological impact of this constant, subtle criticism was exhausting and demoralizing. I found myself approaching every wedding-related decision with anxiety about how Dad might react, mentally preparing defensive explanations for choices that shouldn't have required justification. The joy and excitement of planning my dream wedding were being systematically undermined by the need to anticipate and manage Dad's disapproval. Mom's role in this dynamic was complicated and painful. While she never directly participated in Dad's gaslighting behavior, she also didn't challenge or contradict his approach to our relationship. When I'd express frustration about Dad's lack of support, Mom would offer gentle explanations that served to normalize his behavior rather than validate my concerns. "Your father just needs time to adjust to the idea of losing his little girl," she'd say. "Men handle these transitions differently than women do. He's not trying to hurt your feelings. He's just processing this change in his own way. Maybe if you gave him a little more time and patience, he'd come around to being more supportive." These explanations sounded reasonable on the surface, but placed the burden of managing Dad's emotional adjustment on me rather than expecting him to behave appropriately toward his daughter's engagement. Mom's suggestions that I should be more patient and understanding implied that my expectations for parental support were unreasonable rather than acknowledging that Dad's behavior was hurtful and inappropriate. The cumulative effect of months of this treatment was a gradual erosion of my confidence in my own judgment and worthiness of unconditional family support. Dad's systematic questioning of my decisions, relationship, and emotional responses had created a state of chronic self-doubt that affected every aspect of wedding planning and my relationship with Jonathan. I began editing my conversations with Dad, sharing fewer details about wedding plans and relationship developments to avoid triggering his subtle criticisms. This self-censorship felt necessary for emotional self-protection, but also created distance and dishonesty in our relationship that had never existed before. The open, trusting communication that had always characterized our bond was being replaced by careful management of information and emotions. Jonathan noticed the changes in my mood and energy levels, particularly after phone calls with my family or visits home. When he'd ask about these interactions, I struggled to explain what was wrong, because Dad's behavior was so subtle and indirect that it was difficult to articulate specific complaints. How do you explain that someone is undermining your confidence without saying anything directly critical? How do you describe emotional manipulation that's disguised as loving concern? The isolation this created was profound and damaging. I felt unable to discuss my family situation honestly with Jonathan because I didn't want to poison his relationship with people who would soon be his in-laws. But I also couldn't find support or validation from my family because Dad's behavior was so skillfully disguised as normal parental concern that calling it out directly seemed impossible. This period of psychological manipulation and emotional gaslighting set the stage for the more direct confrontations that would come later. By systematically undermining my confidence and sense of reality, Dad created conditions where his eventual ultimatums and direct disapproval would feel like natural progressions rather than shocking betrayals. The foundation of trust and mutual respect that had always supported our relationship was being quietly eroded, preparing the ground for the explosive confrontation that would define our wedding day. The wedding was now only 2 months away, and the tension between maintaining family peace and planning the celebration of my dreams had reached a breaking point. Every conversation with Dad left me feeling emotionally drained and questioning decisions that Jonathan and I had made together with excitement and confidence. The accumulation of subtle criticisms and veiled disapproval was affecting my sleep, my appetite, and my ability to enjoy what should have been the happiest time of my life. The breaking point came during a routine phone call on a Tuesday evening in March. I had called home to share news about finalizing our wedding cake design, a beautiful 3-tier creation that incorporated both traditional American elements and subtle Korean-inspired decorative touches. The baker had done an amazing job creating something that honored both of our backgrounds while being absolutely stunning to look at. Dad's response to my enthusiastic description was immediate and cutting. "Sounds like you're going all out to accommodate his family's preferences," he said, his tone loaded with implications I couldn't ignore. "I hope they appreciate all the effort you're putting into making sure they feel comfortable at your wedding. Sometimes I wonder if you remember that this is supposed to be about what you want, not what impresses his people." The phrase, "his people," hit me like a physical blow. In 2 words, Dad had revealed the racial undertones that had been lurking beneath months of subtle criticism and manufactured concerns. Jonathan wasn't just a man Dad disapproved of for personal or practical reasons. He was part of them, a different category of people who were somehow incompatible with us. My immediate response was defensive and emotional. "Jonathan's family isn't his people, Dad. They're going to be my family too. And the cake design incorporates elements from both our backgrounds because that's what couples do when they respect each other's heritage and want to create something beautiful together." Dad's reply revealed even more of his true feelings. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Rebecca. You used to have pride in your own heritage, your own family traditions. Now everything has to be mixed and blended to accommodate people who will never truly see you as one of them. You're bending over backward to fit into their world. But what are they giving up to fit into yours?" The accusation that I was abandoning my own heritage and family traditions was both hurtful and completely inaccurate. Jonathan had never asked me to change anything about myself or my background. If anything, he'd encouraged me to share my family's traditions and had expressed genuine interest in learning about my culture and upbringing. The integration of our backgrounds in wedding planning had been a mutual decision made out of love and respect, not pressure or obligation. But Dad's perception was clearly different. In his mind, any accommodation of Jonathan's Korean heritage was evidence of my capitulation to foreign influences that threatened his daughter's American identity. The wedding cake, which I saw as a beautiful symbol of our union, Dad interpreted as proof that I was prioritizing Jonathan's family over my own. The conversation escalated quickly from there. When I tried to explain that respecting Jonathan's background didn't mean abandoning my own, Dad's response revealed depths of prejudice I had never suspected existed. "You can't serve 2 masters, Rebecca. Either you're proud to be a Torres, proud of your Texas roots and American values, or you're trying to become something else to please people who will never fully accept you anyway." The either-or framing of cultural identity was both simplistic and deeply offensive. Dad was essentially arguing that marrying Jonathan required me to choose between being authentically American and being authentically married, as if love and respect for another culture somehow diminished my own identity. This perspective revealed not just prejudice against Jonathan's family, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what marriage and partnership actually meant. When I pressed Dad to explain exactly what he meant by American values and how Jonathan's family failed to embody them, his response became even more troubling. "I'm talking about loyalty to family, respect for parents, understanding your place in the community," he said. "These people come from a different system with different priorities. Family means something different to them. Respect means something different. They may seem polite and educated, but underneath they have their own agenda." The irony of Dad lecturing me about family loyalty while simultaneously undermining my engagement was painful and obvious. He was demanding that I choose loyalty to his prejudices over loyalty to the man I loved, insisting that real family support meant abandoning my future husband to appease my father's irrational fears and biases. The most devastating moment came when Dad finally stated his ultimatum clearly and directly. "I've been trying to be patient and give you time to see reason," he said, his voice taking on a cold, determined tone I'd never heard before. "But it's clear that you're determined to go through with this mistake regardless of how it affects your family. So, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully." The pause that followed felt endless, filled with the weight of impending words that would change everything between us. When Dad continued, his voice was steady but filled with an anger that seemed to have been building for months. "If you marry this man, you're choosing him and his family over the people who raised you, sacrificed for you, and loved you before he ever existed. You're choosing a life that will take you away from everything you've ever known and everyone who truly understands you. And if that's the choice you want to make, then you'll have to live with the consequences." The ultimatum was clear even though Dad hadn't stated it in explicit terms. Marriage to Jonathan would mean losing my relationship with him, and by extension, with the family that had been the foundation of my identity and security for 27 years. The man who had taught me about unconditional love was revealing that his love had always been conditional, dependent on my making choices that aligned with his comfort level and worldview. My response was immediate and emotional. "Are you seriously asking me to choose between the man I love and my family? Are you telling me that your support and acceptance depend on me staying single, or only marrying someone you approve of based on their race and background?" Dad's answer was devastating in its clarity. "I'm telling you that actions have consequences, and marrying someone from a completely different world will have consequences for your relationship with the family that's always been there for you. If you're willing to accept those consequences, that's your choice to make." The conversation ended shortly after that, with both of us too angry and hurt to continue talking productively. But the damage was done. The truth about Dad's feelings toward Jonathan and our upcoming marriage was now completely clear, stripped of the subtle manipulations and indirect criticisms that had characterized his previous approach. That night, I sat in our Austin apartment trying to process the full implications of what Dad had revealed. The man who had been my hero, my role model, and my greatest source of security had essentially disowned me for falling in love with someone whose background differed from our own. The conditional nature of his love, hidden beneath years of apparent unconditional support, had finally been exposed. Jonathan found me crying on our couch at midnight, unable to sleep or make sense of the emotional devastation I was experiencing. Explaining the conversation to him was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to do. Not because I was ashamed of his heritage or our relationship, but because I was ashamed of my father's behavior and the pain it was causing both of us. The truth bomb Dad had detonated didn't just destroy my illusions about his acceptance of Jonathan. It shattered my understanding of who he was as a person and what our relationship had actually meant. The foundation of love and support I'd built my life upon was revealed to be contingent on my conformity to his narrow definition of acceptable choices and appropriate partners. With 2 months until our wedding, the question was no longer whether Dad approved of my marriage to Jonathan, but whether he would be present for the ceremony at all. The ultimatum he'd delivered left little room for compromise or reconciliation, setting the stage for the confrontation that would define our wedding day and potentially end our relationship forever. The 8 weeks between Dad's ultimatum and our wedding day were the most emotionally turbulent period of my adult life. What should have been the final stretch of joyful preparation became a constant battle between hope and despair, as I alternated between believing Dad would come to his senses and accepting that he might actually follow through on his implied threat to boycott my wedding. Mom became the reluctant messenger between Dad and me during this period, as direct communication between us had essentially ceased after our explosive phone conversation. Through her, I learned that Dad was telling extended family members that he had serious concerns about my upcoming marriage and wasn't sure he could support it in good conscience. The idea that he was discussing his disapproval with aunts, uncles, and cousins was humiliating and devastating. The ripple effects of Dad's campaign against my marriage began affecting other family relationships as well. My cousin Maria called to ask if the wedding was still happening, because Uncle Roberto had told her father there might be some family issues that could affect the celebration. Having to explain that my own father was opposing my marriage because of his prejudice against Jonathan's Korean heritage was one of the most embarrassing conversations I'd ever had with a family member. Jonathan's response to this family crisis was everything I could have hoped for and more. Instead of suggesting we postpone the wedding or trying to find ways to appease Dad's concerns, he remained steadfast in his support of our decision to marry regardless of my family's approval. "I love you, Rebecca," he told me during one of my many tearful breakdowns. "I want to marry you whether your father is there to witness it or not. His prejudice is his problem, not ours." But Jonathan also recognized how much pain Dad's rejection was causing me and encouraged me to make one final attempt at reconciliation before giving up entirely. Maybe if we met with him together in person, he'd be able to see past his preconceptions and understand that I love you and will take good care of you, he suggested. Sometimes people's fears are based on not knowing someone personally rather than actual incompatibility. The idea of a face-to-face confrontation terrified me, but I agreed that we owed it to ourselves and our future to try every possible avenue for resolution before accepting that Dad would miss our wedding. We planned a trip to Millerville for the weekend, 3 weeks before the wedding, with the explicit purpose of having an honest conversation about Dad's objections and seeing if there was any path forward that could preserve our family relationship. The drive from Austin to my hometown felt like preparing for battle. Jonathan and I rehearsed potential conversations, trying to anticipate Dad's arguments and prepare thoughtful responses that might help him see reason. We agreed that I would take the lead in addressing his concerns while Jonathan would focus on demonstrating his character and commitment to me through his words and behavior. When we arrived at my childhood home on Saturday afternoon, the tension was immediately palpable. Mom greeted us with nervous energy, clearly hoping this meeting might resolve the family crisis, but uncertain about the outcome. Dad emerged from his workshop in the garage, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression carefully neutral but unmistakably hostile. The conversation we'd planned to have over dinner that evening started much earlier when Dad made it clear that he had no interest in small talk or pleasantries. "I assume you're here to discuss the wedding situation," he said bluntly, settling into his recliner with the posture of someone preparing for an unpleasant but necessary confrontation. I had prepared what I thought was a reasonable opening statement about wanting to understand his specific concerns and see if we could find common ground. But Dad interrupted me before I could finish explaining our purpose for the visit. "My concerns are simple, Rebecca. You're making a mistake that will affect the rest of your life, and I can't pretend to support something I fundamentally disagree with." When I asked him to explain what specifically he disagreed with about our relationship, Dad's response was more direct and brutal than anything he'd said previously. "I disagree with you marrying someone who will never truly understand you, who comes from a completely different world with different values and expectations. I disagree with you having children who won't know what culture they belong to or where their loyalties should lie." The mention of hypothetical future children revealed depths of Dad's prejudice that I hadn't fully understood before. He wasn't just objecting to my marriage. He was rejecting potential grandchildren because they would be mixed race. The man who had taught me that character mattered more than appearance was now arguing that racial and cultural purity were essential for family stability and identity. Jonathan, who had remained silent during the initial exchange, finally spoke up to address Dad's concerns directly. "Mr. Torres, I understand that my background is different from Rebecca's, but I hope you can see that we share the same fundamental values about family, hard work, and treating people with respect. I love your daughter deeply, and I'm committed to building a life with her that honors both of our heritage and creates new traditions together." Dad's response to Jonathan's respectful attempt at connection was devastating in its dismissiveness. "Son, I'm sure you believe what you're saying, and I'm sure you think you understand what you're getting into. But you don't know our family, our history, our way of doing things. And Rebecca doesn't really know yours, no matter how much time you've spent together. Marriage is hard enough when people come from the same background. When you add cultural differences, language barriers, and competing family loyalties, the odds of success drop significantly." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Dad systematically dismantling every argument we presented about love conquering differences, shared values transcending cultural backgrounds, and the beauty of blending traditions. His responses revealed a worldview based on fear, insularity, and the belief that difference inherently meant incompatibility. The most painful moment came when Dad addressed me directly, his voice filled with disappointment and anger. "I raised you to be proud of who you are, where you come from, and what your family stands for. I taught you about loyalty, respect, and the importance of staying true to your roots. But somewhere along the way, you decided that what I taught you wasn't good enough. You decided you needed to find someone exotic and different to make your life more interesting." The accusation that I was marrying Jonathan to make my life more interesting, rather than because I genuinely loved him, was both offensive and completely inaccurate. Dad was reducing my relationship to a form of rebellious experimentation, rather than recognizing it as the deep, committed partnership it actually was. When I tried to defend the authenticity of my feelings and the strength of our relationship, Dad's response revealed the ultimate source of his opposition. "This isn't about him personally, Rebecca. I'm sure he's a decent enough person. This is about you choosing to complicate your life unnecessarily when you could have found someone suitable from your own community who would understand you without requiring translation and explanation." The word "suitable" hung in the air, like a weapon. Dad was essentially arguing that Jonathan was inherently unsuitable as a husband, not because of any character flaws or incompatibilities, but simply because of his ethnic background. No amount of love, compatibility, or shared values could overcome the fundamental unsuitability of his Korean heritage in Dad's assessment. The meeting ended with Dad delivering his final ultimatum more explicitly than he had during our phone conversation weeks earlier. "If you go through with this wedding, Rebecca, you're choosing to prioritize this relationship over your family relationships. And if that's your choice, then you'll need to accept that there will be consequences. I won't pretend to celebrate something I believe is a mistake, and I won't participate in a ceremony that I think will ultimately cause you pain and regret." As we drove back to Austin that evening, both Jonathan and I were emotionally exhausted and devastated by the complete failure of our reconciliation attempt. Dad had revealed the full extent of his prejudice and made it clear that no argument or evidence would change his fundamental opposition to our marriage. The father I had idealized and adored had shown himself to be capable of hatred and rejection that I never could have imagined. The truth about Dad's real reasons for opposing my marriage was now completely clear. This wasn't about protecting me from a bad relationship or ensuring my future happiness. This was about his inability to accept that love could exist across cultural lines, and his belief that racial and ethnic purity were more important than character, compatibility, and mutual devotion. With 3 weeks until our wedding, I finally understood that Dad's absence from the ceremony wasn't just a possibility, but a certainty. The man who had promised to always support my happiness had chosen his prejudices over his daughter, setting the stage for the public confrontation that would define our wedding day and change our relationship forever. The 3 weeks following. That disastrous confrontation at my childhood home became a descent into emotional chaos that threatened to destroy not just my relationship with Dad, but my mental health and ability to function in daily life. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake replaying every word of our conversation, searching for some missed opportunity to change his mind or some sign that reconciliation might still be possible. My work performance suffered dramatically as concentration became nearly impossible. During client meetings, I'd find myself mentally rehearsing conversations with Dad that would never happen, imagining scenarios where he'd realize his mistake and beg forgiveness for his prejudice. Colleagues noticed my distraction and declining output, but explaining that my father's racism was destroying my wedding planning seemed too personal and humiliating to discuss in a professional setting. Jonathan watched helplessly as I spiraled into a depression deeper than anything I'd experienced before. The woman who had always been decisive and confident was now second-guessing every wedding decision, wondering if Dad's absence would cast a shadow over moments that should have been pure joy. When the florist called to confirm final arrangements, I broke down crying in the middle of the conversation, unable to focus on centerpiece details when my father wouldn't be there to appreciate them. Food became another casualty of my emotional state. The stress of Dad's rejection killed my appetite, and I lost 12 pounds in those 3 weeks, dropping to a weight that made my wedding dress require last-minute alterations. Friends who saw me during this period were shocked by my appearance, commenting on my gaunt cheeks and the dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. The wedding dress fittings became particularly torturous experiences. Standing in front of mirrors wearing the gown I'd dreamed about since childhood, all I could think about was walking down the aisle without Dad beside me. The seamstress, unaware of the family drama, kept talking about how emotional fathers get when they see their daughters in wedding dresses, each comment feeling like a knife twist in my already wounded heart. Mom tried to serve as peacemaker during this period, calling me frequently with updates about Dad's mood and hints that he might still change his mind before the wedding day. These conversations were simultaneously hopeful and devastating as she'd describe signs that Dad was struggling with his decision, while confirming that he remained committed to boycotting the ceremony. "He's been quiet and withdrawn," Mom reported during one particularly painful call. "He spends hours in his workshop, but I don't think he's actually working on anything. Yesterday I found him looking at your graduation photos, just staring at them with the saddest expression. I think he knows he's making a mistake, but his pride won't let him admit it." These glimpses into Dad's internal struggle were almost worse than complete silence would have been. The possibility that he might be suffering but still unwilling to change his position added guilt to my already overwhelming emotional burden. Part of me wanted to call him and offer some face-saving compromise that might allow him to attend the wedding without fully endorsing my marriage, while another part of me was furious that his comfort mattered more than my happiness. Jonathan's family tried to fill the emotional void left by Dad's rejection, but their kindness only highlighted what I was losing from my own family. When Jonathan's mother offered to have her brother walk me down the aisle as a gesture of inclusion, I appreciated the thoughtfulness while feeling devastated that such arrangements were necessary. The wedding that should have celebrated the joining of two families was instead exposing the fractures in my own. Sleep medications and anxiety prescriptions became necessary tools for basic functioning as the wedding approached. My doctor, concerned about my weight loss and obvious distress, suggested postponing the ceremony until family issues could be resolved, but I refused to let Dad's prejudice dictate the timeline of my life any further. If he chose to miss our wedding because of his own biases, that was his loss to bear. The bachelorette party, planned months earlier when I'd assumed Dad would be proudly walking me down the aisle, became an exercise in pretending joy I didn't feel. My college friends and coworkers had organized a weekend celebration filled with activities designed to honor the bride-to-be, but every moment of forced happiness reminded me of the family celebration that wouldn't be happening. During the party, when friends were sharing stories about their relationships with their fathers and their wedding day memories, I had to excuse myself to cry in the bathroom. The contrast between their loving family experiences and my current reality was too painful to bear in public. Several friends followed me to offer comfort, but how do you explain that your father has disowned you for falling in love with someone of a different ethnicity? The rehearsal dinner presented another emotional minefield. Jonathan's parents had graciously offered to host the event, transforming it into a beautiful celebration at an upscale restaurant in Austin. But the empty seats where my extended family should have been sitting served as visible reminders of Dad's campaign against our marriage. Uncle Mike, who had always been close to Dad, sent his regrets at the last minute, explaining that he didn't want to take sides in family disagreements. Mom attended the rehearsal dinner alone, putting on a brave face while clearly uncomfortable being the sole representative of my family at such an important event. When Jonathan's father gave a heartfelt speech about welcoming me into their family and expressing excitement about our future together, I could see tears in Mom's eyes as she applauded, probably thinking about the speech Dad should have been giving instead. The night before the wedding was the longest of my life. Despite exhaustion from weeks of stress and emotional turmoil, sleep was impossible as I alternated between hope that Dad might surprise me by showing up and resignation that I'd be walking down the aisle without him. At 3 a.m, I found myself staring at my phone, debating whether to call him one final time to plead for his presence at the ceremony. Jonathan found me crying on our couch at dawn, still in the clothes I'd worn to the rehearsal dinner, emotionally destroyed by the anticipation of celebrating the most important day of my life while being rejected by the most important person in my world. What if he's right? I asked through my tears. What if we're making a mistake and he can see something we're too blinded by love to recognize? The doubt that Dad's systematic campaign had planted in my mind was threatening to undermine everything Jonathan and I had built together. His response was gentle but firm, reminding me of all the reasons we belonged together and refusing to let my father's prejudice poison our relationship retroactively. Rebecca, your father isn't rejecting you because he sees problems in our relationship. He's rejecting you because he can't see past the color of my skin and the shape of my eyes. That's his limitation, not our problem. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. A perfect Texas spring day that should have filled me with joy and anticipation. Instead, I woke up with a sense of dread about walking down the aisle while Dad sat at home, choosing his prejudice over his daughter's happiness. The bridal suite at the hotel was filled with flowers, champagne, and excitement from my bridesmaids, but I felt disconnected from the celebration, as if I were watching someone else's wedding preparation from outside. My own body, getting into my wedding dress, should have been a moment of pure magic, but all I could think about was how Dad would never see me wearing it, never have the chance to tell me I looked beautiful, never experienced the traditional father-daughter moments that I'd dreamed about since childhood. The dress that had seemed perfect during fittings now felt like a costume for a role I wasn't sure I was ready to play. Mom arrived at the bridal suite 2 hours before the ceremony, and I could see in her eyes that Dad hadn't changed his mind. She tried to maintain optimism, suggesting that he might still decide to come at the last minute, but we both knew that his absence was now inevitable. The man who had never missed a single important event in my life was about to boycott the most significant day I'd ever experienced. As we prepared to leave for the church, I made the decision that would define how I handled Dad's rejection. Instead of allowing his absence to destroy my wedding day, I would celebrate the love Jonathan and I shared and the family relationships that did support our happiness. Dad's prejudice was his burden to carry. I refused to let it become mine. as well. The wedding would proceed with or without him, and I would find a way to create joy despite his betrayal. The drive to the church felt like approaching a battlefield where the outcome was uncertain, but the stakes were absolute. Either I would find the strength to celebrate my marriage despite Dad's absence, or his rejection would poison the most important day of my life forever. As we pulled into the church parking lot, I still held on to a fragment of hope that Dad might be waiting inside, having realized at the last moment that his daughter's happiness mattered more than his prejudices. The hour before the ceremony became an unexpected period of clarity and strength that transformed my perspective on everything that had transpired over the previous months. Standing in the church's bridal preparation room, surrounded by friends who had traveled from across the country to celebrate with us, I experienced a profound shift in understanding about what family actually meant and where my priorities should lie. My maid of honor, Jessica, had been my roommate during college and had witnessed my relationship with Dad during those formative years. She knew better than anyone how devastating his rejection had been and how much his absence from this day was costing me emotionally. When she found me staring out the window at the parking lot, still hoping to see his truck pull in despite everything that had happened, her words cut through my despair with perfect clarity. "Rebecca, look around this room," she said, gesturing to the women who had gathered to support me on this day. "Your college friends drove here from Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Chicago. Jonathan's sister took time off from medical residency to be here. Your coworkers used vacation days to attend your wedding. These people love you enough to rearrange their lives to celebrate your happiness. That's what real family looks like." Her observation forced me to recognize something I'd been too consumed by Dad's rejection to appreciate. The room was filled with people who had chosen to prioritize my joy over their own convenience, who had invested time, money, and emotional energy in supporting a decision that made me happy. Their presence represented unconditional love in its purest form, free from the prejudices and conditions that had poisoned Dad's support. Jonathan's mother appeared in the doorway at that moment, carrying a small wrapped box and wearing an expression of gentle concern that reminded me of my own mother during my childhood illnesses. "Rebecca, I have something for you," she said, her accent still carrying traces of her Korean heritage despite decades in America. "This was my grandmother's, given to me on my wedding day, and I'd like you to wear it today." Inside the box was a delicate silver bracelet with small charms representing different aspects of life. A tiny house for home, interlinked hearts for love, a small tree for growth, and other symbols I didn't immediately recognize but that somehow felt meaningful and appropriate. As she fastened it around my wrist, Jonathan's mother shared the story of how the bracelet had traveled from Seoul to California to Texas, carrying with it the hopes and blessings of generations of women who had worn it on their wedding days. "My grandmother told me that family isn't just about blood," she said softly. "It's about the people who choose to love you and support you through all of life's changes. Today you're becoming my daughter not because of legal documents, but because my son loves you and you make him happy. That makes you family in the truest sense." The acceptance and warmth in her voice provided a stark contrast to the conditional love Dad had ultimately revealed. Here was a woman who had every right to question whether I was good enough for her son, who could have imposed cultural expectations or demanded that I conform to her family's traditions. Instead, she was offering unconditional inclusion and genuine affection, asking nothing in return except that I continue making her son happy. My bridesmaids rallied around me during that final hour, sharing memories of the relationship they'd witnessed between Jonathan and me, reminding me of all the reasons we belonged together regardless of anyone else's approval. They talked about seeing us together at parties, watching how we supported each other through career challenges, and observing the way we brought out each other's best qualities. "You light up differently when he's around," said my friend Amy, who had been particularly vocal about previous boyfriends she'd considered unworthy of me. "I've never seen you as genuinely happy as you've been since you started dating Jonathan. That kind of compatibility is rare and precious. Don't let anyone convince you to give it up because they're too narrow-minded to appreciate what you have. These perspectives helped me understand that Dad's rejection said more about his limitations than about my relationship or decisions. The people who knew me best and cared most about my well-being could see clearly that Jonathan and I were right for each other. Dad's inability to recognize that compatibility was his failure, not our problem. As the ceremony time approached, I made the conscious decision to reframe Dad's absence as liberation rather than abandonment. Instead of walking down the aisle feeling incomplete because he wasn't beside me, I would celebrate the freedom to marry the man I loved without compromising my values or his dignity to appease someone else's prejudices. Dad's rejection was painful, but it was also clarifying, showing me exactly where his priorities lay and allowing me to adjust my expectations accordingly. The transformation wasn't complete or painless, but it was real and empowering. When Mom appeared to tell me that Dad definitely wouldn't be coming, that he was at home in his workshop rather than at his daughter's wedding, I felt sad but no longer desperate. His choice revealed his character more clearly than anything he could have said, and I was finally ready to accept that revelation and move forward accordingly. Jonathan's uncle, who had flown in from Seattle specifically to attend our wedding despite having met me only once, offered to walk me down the aisle when he learned about Dad's absence. The gesture was thoughtful and generous, but I declined. With gratitude, having decided that I wanted to walk alone as a symbol of my independence and self-determination, this wedding would represent my choice to prioritize love over fear, inclusion over prejudice, and hope over resentment. The music began, and my bridesmaids started their processional down the aisle toward the altar where Jonathan waited with his groomsmen. Through the crack in the door, I could see the church filled with people who had chosen to celebrate with us, their faces bright with anticipation and joy. The sight was both beautiful and validating, confirming that we had built a community of support that transcended blood relationships and cultural boundaries. As I prepared to make my own walk down the aisle, I thought about all the lessons this experience had taught me about love, family, and the courage required to live authentically. Dad's rejection had been devastating, but it had also forced me to develop strength and independence I might never have discovered otherwise. I was about to marry an incredible man who loved me unconditionally, surrounded by people who celebrated our happiness, free from the need to compromise my values to maintain toxic relationships. The church doors opened, and I stepped into the aisle alone, but not lonely, walking toward a future built on mutual respect, genuine compatibility, and unconditional acceptance. Dad's empty seat in the front row was visible as I walked, but instead of causing pain, it served as a reminder of what real love looked like by contrast. The man waiting for me at the altar had never asked me to change, never demanded that I choose between him and other relationships, never made his support conditional on my conformity to his expectations. This walk down the aisle became my declaration of independence from toxic family dynamics and my commitment to building relationships based on love rather than obligation, acceptance rather than control, and growth rather than stagnation. Dad's rejection had ultimately become the catalyst for the most important personal transformation of my life, teaching me that sometimes losing someone who doesn't truly support you is the first step toward finding the family you actually deserve. The ceremony proceeded beautifully for the first 20 minutes, with every element unfolding exactly as Jonathan and I had planned during months of careful preparation. The music was perfect, the flowers were stunning, and the love radiating from our gathered friends and family created an atmosphere of pure joy that almost made me forget about Dad's conspicuous absence from the front row. Pastor Williams delivered a thoughtful homily about the courage required to build bridges between different cultures and backgrounds, his words seeming particularly relevant given the family tensions that had preceded this day. Jonathan and I exchanged personalized vows that brought tears to many eyes, speaking about our commitment to honoring both of our heritages while creating new traditions together. The moment that changed everything came during the traditional pause when Pastor Williams asked if anyone present knew of any reason why Jonathan and I should not be united in marriage. The question was typically a formality that passed without incident. But as the words hung in the air, I heard the church's heavy wooden doors burst open with a crash that reverberated throughout the sanctuary. Dad stood in the doorway, clearly intoxicated and swaying slightly as he surveyed the scene before him. His appearance was disheveled, his shirt partially untucked and his hair uncombed, presenting a stark contrast to the formal atmosphere of the wedding ceremony. The expression on his face was one of rage mixed with desperation, as if he'd been wrestling with demons and had finally succumbed to them. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice echoing off the church's high ceiling and causing every head to turn in his direction. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of his unsteady footsteps as he began walking down the center aisle toward the altar where Jonathan and I stood frozen in shock and horror. "Sarah, you're making the biggest mistake of your life," he continued, using my childhood nickname in a voice that carried both authority and desperation. "These people will never accept you, and you'll never truly belong with them. Don't throw away your real family for some fantasy about love conquering all differences." The humiliation was immediate and complete. Every person in that church was witnessing my father's public breakdown, his racist tirade disguised as paternal concern, his complete disregard for the sanctity of the ceremony or my feelings. Guests were shifting uncomfortably in their pews, some looking away in embarrassment, while others stared in fascination at the drama unfolding before them. Jonathan stepped protectively closer to me, his jaw tight with controlled anger as he watched my father continue his approach toward the altar. I could feel the tension radiating from him as he fought the urge to confront Dad directly, understanding that any response might escalate the situation beyond repair. His restraint in that moment, when someone was publicly humiliating the woman he loved, demonstrated a maturity and wisdom that made Dad's behavior seem even more inappropriate by comparison. "Roberto, please don't do this," Mom's voice called from somewhere behind him, her tone pleading and embarrassed as she hurried down the aisle in an attempt to stop his tirade. But Dad was beyond reasoning or restraint, fueled by alcohol and months of suppressed anger about my relationship choices. "If you go through with this, Sarah, you're dead to us," he declared, his voice breaking with emotion as he reached the front of the church. "Dead to your real family. Don't come crawling back when this falls apart and you realize what you've lost." The finality of those words hit me like a physical blow. In front of 150 wedding guests, including Jonathan's extended family who had traveled from across the country to meet me, my own father was disowning me for marrying the man I loved. The public nature of his rejection added layers of humiliation to the already devastating emotional impact of his ultimatum. The silence that followed Dad's declaration seemed to stretch forever as everyone in the church processed what had just happened. Pastor Williams stood at the altar with his mouth slightly open, clearly having never encountered such a disruption during his decades of performing wedding ceremonies. The wedding party remained frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or allow the situation to resolve itself somehow. But Dad wasn't finished with his destructive performance. Before anyone could respond to his initial outburst, he continued with even more hurtful accusations and demands. "Look around, Sarah. Do you see any of his people making sacrifices for this wedding? Do you see them bending over backward to accommodate our traditions? This whole ceremony is designed to make them comfortable while you abandon everything I taught you about family loyalty and respect." The irony of Dad lecturing me about family loyalty while publicly humiliating me at my own wedding was lost on him in his intoxicated state, but it wasn't lost on anyone else present. His version of family loyalty apparently required me to prioritize his prejudices over my own happiness, to sacrifice my future to protect his comfort with racial and cultural uniformity. As Dad delivered his ultimatum and prepared to storm out of the church, I experienced a moment of perfect clarity about the choice I was being forced to make. He was demanding that I choose between his approval and my marriage, between his version of family loyalty and my commitment to the man I loved. The public nature of his demand made the stakes even higher, as my response would be witnessed by everyone important to both Jonathan and me. In that moment of crisis, I realized that Dad had actually done me a favor by making his prejudice so explicit and public. There was no longer any ambiguity about his motivations, no way to rationalize his behavior as legitimate concern rather than racist rejection. His drunken tirade had revealed the true nature of his opposition to my marriage, stripping away all pretense and forcing everyone present to see him exactly as he was. The opportunity for transformation that this crisis presented was immediately apparent. I could allow Dad's rejection to destroy my wedding day and poison my marriage before it even began. Or I could use this moment to demonstrate my commitment to the values Jonathan and I shared: dignity, respect, and unconditional love. The choice was mine, and everyone in that church was waiting to see how I would respond to this ultimate test of character and resolve. Looking at Jonathan's face as he stood beside me during Dad's tirade, I saw no judgment or anger directed toward me, only protective love and concern for my well-being. His expression made it clear that he understood Dad's behavior was not my responsibility, and that it didn't change his feelings about our marriage or our future together. The contrast between his steady, supportive presence and Dad's explosive, destructive behavior could not have been more stark or revealing. This moment of crisis had become the ultimate opportunity to choose love over fear, acceptance over prejudice, and hope over resentment. Dad's public rejection was painful beyond description, but it was also liberating, freeing me from the burden of trying to maintain a relationship with someone whose love was conditional on my conformity to his narrow worldview. The real test wasn't whether I could win Dad's approval, but whether I had the courage to live authentically without it. As Dad turned to storm out of the church after delivering his ultimatum, muttering additional complaints about foreigners and family disloyalty, under his breath, something extraordinary happened that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. From the third row on Jonathan's side of the church, an older gentleman rose from his seat with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to commanding attention without raising his voice. Robert Kim, Jonathan's father, had been sitting silently. Throughout Dad's tirade, his expression carefully neutral as he observed the family drama unfolding before him. I had met him only twice before the wedding, as his international business responsibilities kept him traveling frequently between the United States and Asia. What I knew about him came primarily through Jonathan's stories about his immigrant parents' success in building a technology empire from nothing. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice carrying just enough volume to halt Dad's retreat toward the church doors. His tone was polite but firm, with the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades making important decisions under pressure. "I believe we haven't been properly introduced. I'm Robert Kim, Jonathan's father." Dad stopped walking and turned back toward the altar, his alcohol-fueled bravado wavering slightly as he registered the controlled power in Robert's voice. The contrast between the two men was immediately apparent. Dad, disheveled and emotional, swaying slightly from his drinking, facing Robert, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, emanating the calm confidence of successful leadership. "I came here today to celebrate my son's marriage to your daughter," Robert continued, stepping into the aisle with measured steps that brought him closer to Dad's position near the back of the church. "I flew directly from Seoul, where I was concluding negotiations for a major acquisition, because nothing was more important than being present for this moment in Jonathan's life." The mention of Seoul and international business negotiations should have been Dad's first clue that he was dealing with someone whose background and accomplishments far exceeded his assumptions about Jonathan's family. But in his intoxicated state, Dad seemed focused more on the confrontation than on processing the implications of what Robert was revealing about his identity and status. "I don't care where you flew from," Dad replied, his voice still aggressive but lacking some of its earlier conviction. Your son is marrying my daughter, and I have every right to express my concerns about this mistake she's making. Family means something in this country, and loyalty means something too." Robert's response was delivered with the kind of controlled precision that comes from years of high-stakes business negotiations where emotional displays are viewed as weaknesses rather than strengths. "You're absolutely right that family and loyalty are important," he said, his tone remaining respectful despite Dad's hostility. "That's why I rearranged international meetings and flew halfway around the world to be here today. Because family celebrations take priority over business obligations." The implicit criticism of Dad's priorities was subtle, but unmistakable. While Robert had traveled thousands of miles to celebrate his son's happiness, Dad had chosen to disrupt his daughter's wedding with a drunken scene designed to destroy rather than support her joy. The contrast in parental behavior was obvious to everyone present, highlighting Dad's failures more effectively than any direct accusation could have accomplished. But Robert wasn't finished revealing information that would completely transform Dad's understanding of the situation. "I should probably mention that my company, Pacific Digital Solutions, recently completed several acquisitions in the energy sector here in Texas. We're particularly interested in expanding our sustainable technology partnerships with American companies, especially those involved in traditional energy production and refining." The color began draining from Dad's face as the implications of Robert's words became clear. Pacific Digital Solutions was a name that had been appearing frequently in industry publications, described as one of the fastest-growing technology conglomerates in Asia with expanding American operations. If Robert was telling the truth about his identity, then Dad had just publicly humiliated himself in front of someone whose business empire dwarfed anything he'd ever encountered. "In fact," Robert continued with the same calm precision, "I believe your employer, Lone Star Refining, was one of the companies we evaluated during our recent acquisition research. Small world, isn't it? I'm always interested in meeting employees from companies in our investment portfolio." The revelation that Dad's employer was part of Robert's business interests created a moment of profound silence in the church as everyone processed the complete reversal of assumptions that had just occurred. Dad, who had spent months describing Jonathan's family as foreigners who would never truly accept his daughter, was now facing the reality that his daughter's new father-in-law was likely his ultimate boss. Mom, who had been standing helplessly near the back of the church trying to minimize the damage from Dad's outburst, looked like she wanted to disappear entirely as the full scope of his mistake became apparent. The man she had been married to for 30 years had just revealed himself to be not only prejudiced and cruel, but also spectacularly wrong about the people he had been criticizing and rejecting. Jonathan, still standing beside me at the altar, allowed himself a small smile as he watched his father handle the situation with the diplomatic skill that had built their family's fortune. He had never mentioned the extent of his father's business empire, preferring to let people judge him on his own merits rather than his family's wealth. But now Robert's success was providing the perfect response to Dad's assumptions about cultural and economic inferiority. "Mr. Torres," Robert said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone that suggested he was transitioning from polite introduction to serious business discussion, "I hope you'll understand that my son's happiness is my primary concern today. If you have legitimate objections to this marriage based on character or compatibility issues, I'd be happy to discuss them with you privately after the ceremony." The offer was generous and diplomatic, providing Dad with an opportunity to save face while also making it clear that Robert was not intimidated by his hostility or impressed by his behavior. It was the response of someone accustomed to managing difficult personalities and finding solutions that preserved everyone's dignity while achieving desired outcomes. But Dad, perhaps recognizing that he was now completely out of his depth and facing consequences he hadn't anticipated, chose retreat over further confrontation. "This isn't over," he muttered, though his voice lacked any conviction or authority. "Sarah knows where to find me when this doesn't work out the way she thinks it will." As Dad finally left the church, his exit far less dramatic than his entrance. Robert returned to his seat with the same quiet dignity he had displayed throughout the confrontation. The crisis that could have destroyed our wedding day had instead revealed the true character of everyone involved, demonstrating beyond any doubt which family members were worthy of respect and which were controlled by fear and prejudice. Pastor Williams, clearly relieved that the disruption had been resolved without violence or further escalation, cleared his throat and addressed the congregation with remarkable composure. "Well, that was certainly unusual," he said with a slight smile that generated nervous laughter from the guests. "But I believe we were in the middle of a beautiful ceremony celebrating the union of two people who clearly belonged together." The recognition shift that occurred in that moment was profound and permanent. Everyone present had witnessed Dad's prejudiced assumptions being demolished by reality, his authority being superseded by someone whose success and dignity far exceeded his own, and his version of family loyalty being revealed as destructive selfishness rather than protective concern. More importantly, I had seen Jonathan's family demonstrate the kind of grace under pressure that spoke to their true character. While Dad had chosen public humiliation and emotional destruction as his tools of opposition, Robert had responded with dignity, respect, and the kind of quiet power that comes from genuine confidence rather than insecurity and fear. The wedding ceremony continued from that point with a lightness and joy that hadn't been present before Dad's interruption. Paradoxically, his attempt to destroy our celebration had actually enhanced it by removing all ambiguity about where family loyalties lay and what kind of people we were choosing to build our lives with. The contrast between his behavior and Robert's response had been so stark that every guest understood exactly which family truly supported love, acceptance, and mutual respect. 6 months have passed since that extraordinary wedding day, and the perspective that time has provided has only reinforced the lessons learned during those dramatic moments in the church. The man who raised me to believe that character mattered more than appearance or background revealed that his own character was fundamentally flawed when tested by circumstances that challenged his comfort and assumptions. The immediate aftermath of the wedding was surprisingly peaceful. After Dad's dramatic exit and Robert's dignified response, the ceremony continued with a warmth and celebration that felt more authentic than it might have otherwise. Jonathan and I exchanged rings and were pronounced husband and wife while surrounded by people who genuinely supported our happiness, free from the underlying tension that Dad's presence would have created. Our reception that evening was filled with stories and laughter as guests processed what they had witnessed earlier in the day. Jonathan's extended family, who had traveled from across the country to attend our wedding, expressed amazement at Robert's handling of the situation and admiration for our resilience in the face of such unexpected drama. Many commented that they had never seen a bride and groom more clearly meant for each other than Jonathan and me. The weeks following our wedding brought a series of revelations about Robert's business empire that put Dad's assumptions and behavior in an even more embarrassing light. Pacific Digital Solutions was indeed one of the largest technology conglomerates in Asia, with American holdings that included not just Lone Star Refining, but dozens of other companies across multiple industries. Robert's wealth was estimated in the billions, making him one of the most successful immigrants in American business history. More importantly than his financial success, however, was the way Robert and his wife welcomed me into their family, with the kind of unconditional acceptance I had always expected from my own parents. They never asked me to change anything about my background or heritage, never suggested that my Texas roots were incompatible with their Korean traditions, and never made me feel like I had to choose between honoring my past and embracing my future. The contrast with Dad's approach couldn't have been more stark. While he had demanded that I reject Jonathan's background to prove my loyalty to my own, Robert's family celebrated the diversity that our marriage represented. They saw strength in combining different traditions rather than weakness, opportunity in bridging different cultures rather than threat, and growth in expanding family boundaries rather than limitation. 3 months after the wedding, Dad finally, reached out through Mom to express regret about his behavior on our wedding day. His message, delivered secondhand and lacking any direct apology or acknowledgement of his prejudice, suggested that he had been under a lot of stress and didn't handle the situation well. The non-apology revealed that he still didn't understand the fundamental wrongness of his actions or the depth of the hurt he had caused. Jonathan and I discussed at length whether to pursue reconciliation with Dad, weighing the value of family relationships against the need to maintain boundaries with toxic behavior. We ultimately decided that any relationship moving forward would need to be built on Dad's genuine recognition of his mistakes and commitment to treating Jonathan with respect, conditions that seemed unlikely to be met based on his indirect approach to addressing the situation. The professional consequences of Dad's wedding day performance were swift and significant. Within 2 weeks of our ceremony, he was called into a meeting at Lone Star Refining, where he was informed that his position was being eliminated as part of a corporate restructuring initiative. While the official explanation focused on efficiency, improvements, and cost reduction, the timing suggested that Robert's business interests had influenced the decision. Dad never made the connection between his behavior toward Robert's son and the sudden changes in his employment situation. At least not that he admitted to Mom during their conversations about his job search difficulties. His inability to recognize the consequences of his actions extended beyond family relationships to professional settings, demonstrating a pattern of poor judgment that had likely been affecting multiple areas of his life. The most profound realization that emerged from this experience was understanding the difference between family relationships based on fear and control versus those built on love and acceptance. Dad's version of family loyalty required conformity to his expectations and sacrifice of individual happiness to maintain group approval. Robert's family demonstrated that true loyalty involves supporting each other's authentic choices and celebrating differences rather than demanding uniformity. This lesson extended far beyond our specific situation to broader questions about how we define family, community, and belonging in an increasingly diverse world. The people who showed up to celebrate our wedding, who supported us through family crisis, and who continue to encourage our happiness are our real family, regardless of blood relationships or shared backgrounds. Family is created through choice, loyalty, and mutual support rather than inherited through genetics or geography. Jonathan and I have built a marriage that honors both of our heritages while creating new traditions that reflect our shared values and dreams. We cook Korean-Mexican fusion dinners that would horrify purists from both cultures, but taste amazing to us. We celebrate holidays from both traditions, creating a calendar that's busier but richer than either of our childhood experiences. We're planning to raise children who will be proudly multicultural, comfortable navigating different worlds without feeling torn between them. The strength of our relationship has been tested and proven by the challenges we faced during our engagement and wedding planning. Today, Jonathan and I celebrate our first anniversary surrounded by people who genuinely love and support us. Dad eventually learned that his new son-in-law's father owns the company that eliminated his position, a revelation that finally made him understand the cost of his prejudice. Robert never confirmed whether Dad's job loss was intentional, but the timing spoke volumes about consequences and karma. The most beautiful irony is that Dad spent months worrying I'd be rejected by Jonathan's family, when the opposite proved true. The Kims embraced me completely, while Dad rejected his own daughter over skin color and heritage. His loss became my greatest gain, teaching me that real family chooses love over fear, acceptance over prejudice, and growth over stagnation. Have you ever had to choose between toxic family expectations and your own happiness? Sometimes the people who claim to love you most are actually the biggest obstacles to your joy. Real love doesn't come with conditions or ultimatums. It celebrates your choices and supports your dreams, even when they look different from what others expected. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.